Hello, I'm Dilek Tuna. Welcome to another episode of Context. Today on the program, we're unpacking the latest developments from the Georgian president's visit to Türkiye. The two leaders held a joint news conference outlining their vision for stronger bilateral ties and deeper regional cooperation. From trade and energy projects to security and diplomacy, we'll explore what these announcements mean for the South Caucasus and the wider neighbourhood. So joining us today on the program is independent researcher and author Bekir İlhan from the Türkiye Research Foundation in Ankara. Bekir, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Now, how significant is the Georgian president's visit to Türkiye in the context of their historical relations, let's say the last decade?
Yeah, for sure. Historically speaking, I would say that the relations between Turkey and Georgia have always been strong, and I would say that in the near future it's getting much more better and will be much more important considering the recent developments in Caucasia and Black Sea. As you know that there is a war in Ukraine and there is a rapprochement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and both regional developments make the relationship between Turkey and Georgia much more important, and also considering the bilateral relations, I would say that the ties are very strong right now, and also Turkey and Georgia have both achieved a trade volume of $3 billion, and the current goal is $5 billion. And regarding the latest presidential visit, I would say many issues were discussed, from economy to diplomacy, from military issues to regional issues. Mm-hmm. But among others, I would say that the important thing was the economy and the trade relations, I would say. But of course, it does not mean that the other issues were not discussed or the other issues were not important. But I think among others, the economic and trade relations occupied an important position on the table, I would say.
Yes, certainly. Now, the leaders certainly did talk about deepening cooperation and boosting trade, as you said. What do you think are the key areas they're prioritising, and what concrete steps do you expect to follow?
Looking at the economic and diplomatic relations between Georgia and Turkey, I would say the two important topics, stands out. One is energy, and the other is the trade itself. And looking at the Caucasian geopolitics, you will see that there is, of course, a strong tie between Turkey and Georgia, and also there is another actor, Azerbaijan. And looking at these trilateral relations between Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we have seen a very important steps toward regional integration between three countries, and I would say both railways, energy routes, and trade routes are important factors, combining together and bringing together these three countries. And I think in the near future, the international trade routes from East Asia to Europe, and from the Central Asia to Europe, these kind of international routes will be much more important. And historically, I would say Georgia especially, has a very important geopolitical position, connecting these trade routes and connecting the various parts of the world, from, like I said, from Central Asia to South Asia to the Europe and Middle East. And also Georgia has emerged as a transit country like Turkey, and also these two countries, between the relations between these two countries has always been a sign of stability and cooperation in a stable region. But I think in the near future, the Caucasian region and the Black Sea region will achieve a stability, and I think that both Turkey and Georgia has much to offer this stability. And in sum, I would say that the trade relations and energy relations, will be much more important in the future between the Georgian and Turkish cooperation context.
Okay. You mentioned Azerbaijan as well, and how the trilateral relationship had such a bearing on the South Caucasus. During the news conference, emphasizing that Georgia will continue its contributions to the Azerbaijan-Armenia peace talks, Kavalishvili said this cooperation is extremely important for the stability of the region. And he added, in terms of success, cooperation, ensuring stability and the development of our countries, the trilateral mechanism between Azerbaijan and Turkey and Georgia is an excellent example. So how does Azerbaijan fit into the trilateral dynamic between Turkey and Georgia?
Of course, like I said, Azerbaijan has always been important parts between the relations between Turkey and Georgia, and I would say Armenia has also much to offer these relations. But historically, Armenia tried to undermine the relations between Azerbaijan and Turkey and also Georgia. But right now we have a peace process, and I think that if Armenia, plays well, if they play smart, I think that Armenia can also be part of this integration and cooperation. And I think that after the liberation of Karabakh and the if Armenia, will support the separatist movements in Karabakh, and if they achieve a peace agreement, I think that Armenia will also be a key actor between Georgia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. And on the other hand, we have Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is an emerging and developing country right now, diplomatically and politically. They are developing good relationship between the neighboring countries. And I would say in the long future, if there is a stability in South Caucasus, I think that Armenia shouldn't exclude itself. Of course, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia is open to trade, is open to diplomacy, is open to the political relations. But I think at this point, it's up to Armenia. If Armenian leadership, plays smart, and they will also gain much more from this cooperation. And also, like I said, they have also much more to offer to this cooperation. And in the long term, there will be a good relations between these four countries. As I said, if Armenia doesn't exclude itself from this process, I would say.
Okay. Bekir, as you mentioned earlier in the piece, two of the main talking points between the two countries were trade and energy. So let's focus on energy for a moment. Turkey is a major transit route for energy projects. How might this visit influence Georgia's role in regional energy corridors? And what role does Georgia see for itself in regional connectivity projects like the Middle Corridor?
Yeah, Middle Corridor is an important energy or trade route right now, but there are challenges on this issue right now because, like you said, it's an international route and it's an international connectivity project. Looking at the international politics in recent years, we have seen a lot of this kind of connectivity project, but like I said, these projects are major projects. These are important projects, and the participant countries needs to invest much more money on these projects. And there are lots of geopolitical, economical, and social challenges, before these projects. But at the end of the day, it's about the will of the countries. If they strengthen the cooperation, if they try to overcome these challenges, I think that in the near future, the South Caucasia will be an important energy transition corridor, and especially Georgia, like I said, has an important geopolitical spot because it's in the very center of the Caucasia, and it's both connects the north part and the south part of the Caucasus, and also it has an important geopolitical position between the eastern side of the world and also the Black Sea and the Middle East. And of course, Turkey is an important country, in this context because, as you see on the map right now, Turkey is also an in-transit country, and I think it's also more than that. Turkey is also a transit country, is also a central country. I would say it's also a central country, but right now I would say walking shoulder to shoulder, Georgia and Turkey will contribute major aspects to these interconnectivity projects, and also in the long run, I would say the political and territorial stability in Georgia will be much more important, because in this kind of geopolitical and trade routes, we're going to see some stable countries, or both economic stability, in terms of both economic stability and political stability, you're going to see stable countries, and I think that in the long run, Georgia and Turkey and also Azerbaijan, if included Armenia, as stable actors, will contribute to these major connectivity projects, I would say.
And let's talk about the Black Sea corridor. What role does that play in the strategic relationship between Ankara and Tbilisi?
Yeah, regarding the Black Sea, Turkey and Georgia, the relationship between these two countries historically has always been important, especially after the war in Ukraine. The Black Sea geopolitics emerged as a very hot spot in the world politics right now, especially after Russia, invaded Crimea. The balance of power in Black Sea has been changed, I would say, and right now the neighboring countries like Turkey and Georgia, if they cooperate on the Black Sea geopolitics, as well as like they did in trade and many security issues, if they cooperate on Black Sea issues, I would say they can counter and they can balance Russian influence. Of course, I'm not saying that Russia is a threat right now to Turkey and Georgia. I'm not saying that, but I would say that Russia is an important country in the Black Sea geopolitics, but they gotta be balanced. They gotta be Turkey, Georgia, and the other neighboring countries, should create a cooperation alliance so that no single country, establish its hegemony on Black Sea. And I think that in terms of trade, in terms of economy, and the other issues when it comes to the Black Sea geopolitics, and Turkey and Georgia in the long term will be important actors. And I think that this is not in a geopolitical alliance. I would say this is just a cooperation between two countries, and I think that this cooperation is not targeted against a single country. But I would say, in realistically looking at the Black Sea geopolitics, Russia has gained much more influence in Black Sea, and I think that the cooperation between Georgia and Turkey will be important in countering Russian influence in the region.
And Bekir, from Georgia's perspective, what does closer cooperation with Turkey achieve strategically? Could these talks mark a shift perhaps in Georgia's broader foreign policy direction?
Yeah, of course, Georgia in recent years tries to develop many relations with other countries, and they try to, diversify their foreign policies, because looking at the post-Soviet geopolitics, we are seeing that Georgia tried to, keep itself away from the Russian influence in the long term. And at this point, Turkey is an important actor, and also I would say Turkey and Georgia, both countries define themselves as strategic partners. They are strategic partners in economic issues, in military issues, and also in many security issues, I would say. But in the long term, I would say both Turkey and Georgia can contribute to their economies, especially economy is an important aspect here, because right now, as far as I know, 2,000 Turkish companies companies are operating in Georgia right now, and they contribute to the Georgian economy. And as I said, the current trade volume between Georgia and Turkey is around $3 billion, and the current target is $5 billion. And in the long term, I will say that this threshold will be increased also. And in the long term, I would say both in terms of economy and military affairs, Turkey and Georgia, cooperates for the stability of the region.
And Becky, let's move on to security now. So alongside trade and energy, that was also a major talking point. The leaders mentioned security cooperation. What specific threats or challenges might this be aimed at, or are there security dimensions to this partnership that we should be paying more attention to?
Especially regarding the security, the number one issue is stability. Stability in the South Caucasus is very important for Turkish perspective and also for the Georgian perspective as well. And also Azerbaijan and Armenia, countries like that, will also benefit from such a stability. But in the long term, I would say looking at the bilateral relations between Turkey and Georgia, yes, of course, there are many potentials for both countries, and I think, especially considering that Georgia is against separatist movements right now, the Turkish drones and Turkish military equipments, if it happens, Turkey can help Georgia to counter these separatist movements in the long term, I would say, because as you know that Turkey in recent years has emerged as a very important defense industry exporter right now. The Turkish military systems and Turkish drones, especially Bayraktars, plays an important role both in Africa and Asia, and also Turkey exports its military equipment to the European Union countries and NATO countries right now. And I would say, why not Georgia? Georgia can also be an important client for Turkish defense industry firms in the mid-run and in the long run, I would say. But on the other hand, we also need to note that Turkey is a NATO ally, but Georgia is not a NATO ally. But I think at this moment, considering Russia's role in the region, the relationship between Turkey and Georgia will be on balance. And I think that Turkey and Georgia will try to increase its bilateral security ties. And I don't think that the NATO alliance will have a role between Turkey and Georgia, because it's another issue right now. But regarding the bilateral ties and bilateral relations, I would say, both in terms of economy and security issues, Turkey has much to do with Georgia and has much to offer for Georgia, both in terms of energy and defense industry, I would say. And also it will help Georgian territorial integrity, because as President Erdogan reiterated today, Turkey is committed to territorial integrity, political integrity of Georgia. But it's not only about Georgia. Of course, Turkey is committed to, and Turkey advocates the territorial and political integrity of neighboring countries, and Turkey is clearly against any separatist movements, any other terrorist movements in the region, and also same applies to Turkish policy on Georgia as well.
Okay. And how do Ankara and Tbilisi balance their close ties with the West and their regional partnerships?
Like I said, regarding Georgia's relations with the West, two organizations are important. One is NATO and the other one is the European Union. But looking at the geopolitical realities, whenever Georgia tried to develop relations with West, Russia tried to undermine it. And also in 2008, Russia just shortly invaded Georgia. And then after that, I would say Georgia has developed a balanced approach to the West, and I don't think that in the long term Georgia will try to integrate with the Western institution, given the recent war in Ukraine. The Russia will not try to allow this happen. But I think instead of a very steadfast or very deep political and economical integration with the West, and Georgia can cooperate with Turkey as a very facilitator country, as a partner country to establish long-term relations with the West. As I said, right now Georgia has as a transit country, and has an important geopolitical position regarding trade and international energy routes right now. And at this point, the relations between Georgia and the West are centered on economic issues. And in the long term, I don't think that there will be a military and security ties, and at least there will be no strong security and military ties between Georgia and the West. But at this point, Turkey could help Georgia to integrate or to mediate between the Georgia and West, so that Russia, in the case that Russia tries to undermine the economic and military affairs between Georgia and West. And like I said, Turkey at this point is an important third party between Georgia and West.
And could this strengthened relationship have any impact on Georgia's relations with Russia? Because in light of recent events and strengthening bilateral ties in the South Caucasus and in the region, Russia is slowly but gradually losing more and more power. How would you evaluate that?
Of course, looking at the bilateral relations between Georgia and Russia, you got to see that Georgia has a very disadvantaged position, and Russia, of course, is a much more powerful country. But as you mentioned, Russia is also losing its influence on the region right now. I think it's a geopolitical opportunity for Georgia in the long term, because, like I said, Georgia tries to diversify its foreign relations, and Turkey is an important country in this matter. But in the long term, I think that Georgia should develop a balanced relationship between Russia and the West. Of course, realistically speaking, Georgia cannot exclude Russia from the region, and also they cannot exclude the United States and the West from the region as well. So they need to develop a balanced approach, both dealing with Russia and the West. Just look at Ukraine. They tried to fully integrate to the Western institutions, but at the end of the day, Russia invaded Ukraine. But Georgia, at this point, will not see such a future. And I think in the long term, with the help of Turkey, I think Georgia will be an important country in the South Caucasian geopolitics, and also it will properly manage its relations with Russia, because, like I said, realistically, you cannot ignore Russian influence in the region. But of course, you are an independent country, you are a sovereign country, you have free choices, you can cooperate with other countries, you can establish military alliance with other countries. But in the realistical term, Russia will try to undermine these steps. But if Georgia wants to avoid these kind of Russian interventions, it should develop a balanced approach. And also, like I said, Turkey is an important country in terms of helping the Georgian political and economic interaction to the West, I would say.
Okay. Lastly, let's go back to the broader view. In your view, what are the long-term strategic implications of today's announcements for the South Caucasus region?
Yeah, South Caucasus region, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, have always been an important geopolitical hotspot. But right now, the rapprochement process between Azerbaijan and Armenia shows that there will be stability in the region. And if this happens, if stability happens, I think that all neighboring countries like Georgia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia will benefit from this stability, because all the region needs is just stability and economic cooperation, and all the countries, all the regional countries needs this kind of cooperation, because they have lost a lot after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Especially Armenia, I would say. Armenia, tried to be against both Azerbaijan and Turkey, and I would say they lost a lot, But in the future, I would say, with the cooperation between these four countries, the regional stability will occur, and also both Azerbaijan and Armenia will benefit from this cooperation. And also, like I said, if these four countries cooperate and if these both countries deepen their economic relations, in the long term, I would say the Russian influence will be also weakened in the region. And maybe this time Russia will try to engage with the regional country, as an equal partner and not a hegemonic or not a power, not as a hegemonic or not as a powerful country, but an equal partner. And also, Iran is also an important country in the South Caucasian geopolitics. Right now, it deals with many security issues, especially the war between Israel and Iran, damaged Iran a lot. But in the long term, if Iran plays well, or if they play smart as well, like Armenia, they can also gain much more. And they, of course, will try to integrate with the cooperation environment in the South Caucasus. But if this does not happen in the long term, all regional countries, all neighboring countries will be weakened against Russia, I would say. But like I said, if cooperation happens and if the neighboring countries achieve a long-term cooperation, I think the South Caucasian area will be a very stable spot in the world politics.
Okay. Bekir, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Now, as Ankara and Tbilisi reaffirmed their commitment to closer ties, today's announcements underscore the strategic weight of the Türkiye-Georgia partnership, not just for bilateral trade and energy, but for the stability and connectivity of the wider region. We'll certainly be watching closely to see how these pledges translate into action. Until next time, thanks for watching.